The champagne was vintage, the lilies were imported from France, and the tension in the air was thick enough to choke every blue-blooded guest in the ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza. I stood there, adjusted my cufflinks, and watched my son, Julian, beam with a radiance I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Beside him, in a Vera Wang gown that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, stood Vivienne St. Clair. She was the picture of bridal perfection, until the photographer moved away, and I stepped into her personal space to offer a congratulatory embrace. As I leaned in, her voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper, a sound that didn't match the angelic lace of her veil. "Get out of here, Arthur. Right now. Go back to your dusty drafting table, and don't come back. You're not welcome in our lives anymore, and Julian is finally under my roof, not yours." I didn't flinch. I had spent 40 years designing skyscrapers in Boston. I knew a thing or two about pressure and structural integrity. I pulled back just enough to look into those icy blue eyes and smiled. It was the kind of smile you give a building right before the controlled demolition begins. "I'll go, Vivienne," I said, my voice steady enough to rattle her. "But I'm not leaving alone." Her smug expression didn't just fade, it curdled. She looked toward the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, expecting to see security. Instead, she saw the ghost of her own past walking toward the head table. She lost control then, her hand trembling so hard the champagne in her flute began to ripple, and I knew the foundation of her lies was about to give way. To understand how we got to this moment of public execution, you have to understand the man I am. I'm Arthur Sterling. For 4 decades, the Sterling firm shaped the skyline of this city. I deal in concrete, steel, and absolute precision. In my world, if a measurement is off by a fraction of an inch, the whole structure is compromised. I retired 3 years ago to a quiet life in Beacon Hill, surrounded by first edition books and the peaceful shadows of a house that had been in my family for 3 generations. I thought my days of stress tests and load-bearing calculations were over. I was looking forward to seeing Julian, my only son and the light of my life after I lost his mother to cancer, take over the firm and find a partner who deserved the Sterling name. The warning bells didn't ring. They hummed at a frequency I almost missed. It was a crisp October afternoon when the doorbell of my townhouse rang. Julian was there, looking more energized than I'd seen him in years. He wasn't alone. He held the hand of a woman who looked like she'd stepped off a yacht in Newport. "Dad, this is Vivienne," he said, his voice brimming with a desperate kind of pride. "Vivienne St. Clair. We're engaged." The engaged part hit me like a physical blow. No phone call, no dinner introduction, no gradual integration into the family. Just a sudden presentation of a finished product. I invited them in, my architect's eye immediately scanning her. Her suit was Chanel, her handbag was Birkin, and her smile was manufactured. It was symmetrical, bright, and reached exactly nowhere near her eyes. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a polished lilt that suggested old money and private tutors. "I've heard so much about the legendary Arthur Sterling, the man who built the Prudential expansion." She didn't call me Arthur. She didn't call me Dad. She treated me like a monument she was visiting. As we sat in the parlor, Julian couldn't stop talking. They had met at a high-end charity gala for the Boston Symphony Her World, or so she claimed. She was a legacy consultant for private estates, a job title that sounded expensive and vague. Within 20 minutes, she was asking about the molding in my hallway, the square footage of the Beacon Hill property, and the historical preservation status of the Sterling family holdings. She wasn't just making conversation. She was taking inventory. I've sat across from enough contractors to know when someone is looking for the quickest way to flip a property. "It's a lot of house for one man, isn't it?" Vivienne remarked, her eyes lingering on a Rembrandt sketch I had inherited from my grandfather. "Julian mentioned you spend most of your time at the Cape Cod house during the summer. It seems a shame for such a significant asset to sit underutilized." Julian laughed, oblivious to the predatory gleam in her eyes. "Vivienne is brilliant with estate management, Dad. She's actually suggested some really innovative ways we could consolidate the Sterling Trust to make it more efficient." Consolidate, efficient, asset. These weren't the words of a woman in love. They were the words of a corporate raider. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, a familiar instinct from the days when I could sense a structural flaw in a blueprint before the first brick was laid. I played the part of the gracious, slightly aging father. I nodded, I smiled, and I watched. I watched the way she touched Julian not with affection, but with possession. She moved him like a piece on a board. A week later, Julian came over alone. He looked nervous, tapping his foot in a way he only did when he was about to deliver bad news. He pulled a thick document from his leather satchel. "Vivienne and I want to be transparent, Dad." She suggested a prenuptial agreement. She says it's the only way to ensure both our families are protected. I put on my reading glasses and took the papers. I didn't expect a simple one-page document, but I didn't expect a 25-page legal fortress either. As I flipped through the clauses, my blood ran cold. Clause Chin. All familial inheritances received by Julian Sterling during the duration of the marriage shall be considered marital property after a period of 12 months. Clause Muy Born. In the event of a dissolution of marriage, the Sterling Beacon Hill property shall be subject to equitable distribution based on its appraised value at the time of filing. It was a roadmap for a heist. Vivienne was already planning the divorce before she'd even bought the flowers for the wedding. "Who drafted this, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "Her family attorney, Harrison Vance. He's top tier, Dad. He handles the Montgomerys and the Lowells. It's for my protection too, you know. She has her own assets to worry about." I looked at my son, my brilliant, kind, but hopelessly romantic son, and I realized he was standing in the middle of a collapsing building, and he thought the falling debris was confetti. I told him I'd look it over, but as soon as the door closed behind him, I went to my study. I didn't call a friend. I called a man named Elias Thorne. He was a fixer I'd met years ago during a nasty zoning dispute where someone had tried to blackmail my firm. Thorne was a man who lived in the cracks of the city, a former intelligence officer who knew that the truth was never found in a parlor. It was found in the trash, in the digital footprints, and in the shadows of a person's past. "I need a deep dive, Elias," I said when he picked up. "Vivienne St. Clair, supposedly Newport old money, works in a state consultancy. I want to know who she is when the cameras aren't on." Thorne's voice was like gravel. "Give me 48 hours for the surface, a week for the bones." "You sound worried, Arthur." "I'm an architect, Elias," I replied, looking out the window at the Charles River. "I know a facade when I see one. I just need to see what's behind the drywall." The next few days were a blur of wedding planning that felt more like an interrogation. Vivienne was constantly over, helping me organize my files, suggesting I digitize my estate documents, and subtly pushing for me to move into a high-end retirement community in Wellesley. She called it the Gentry, a place for men of my stature. I knew what it really was, a way to get me out of the Beacon Hill house so she could move in. I played along. I pretended my memory was starting to slip. I let her think her gaslighting was working. "Oh, Arthur," she'd say with a patronizing pat on my hand, "did you forget you promised Julian you'd sign the trust transfer papers this weekend? Don't worry. The aging process is a journey we all take." I hadn't promised any such thing, but I'd nod and look confused, all while my heart pounded with a rage that was becoming hard to contain. Then, 10 days after I hired him, Elias Thorne called me. He didn't speak over the phone. He told me to meet him at a dive bar in South Boston, a place where the air smelled of stale beer and secrets. He handed me a manila envelope. "You were right to call, Arthur. Vivienne St. Clair doesn't exist. At least, not the one you met." I opened the envelope. There was a photo of a woman who looked like Vivienne, but younger, harsher. Her hair was dark, her clothes were cheap. The name on the birth certificate wasn't Vivienne St. Clair. It was Vicky Slattery. From a small town outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania, there was a marriage certificate from 5 years ago to a man named Thomas Miller in Philadelphia. Then a divorce decree 18 months later. Thomas Miller was a wealthy widower who had died of a sudden heart ailment 6 months after the divorce was finalized, leaving her a significant settlement. Then there was another, a marriage to a Sterling Harrison, no relation to us in Chicago, a wealthy real estate mogul. Another divorce. Another settlement. She was a professional. She didn't just marry for money. She dismantled men's lives and moved on to the next project. But the most chilling part wasn't the past. It was the present. Thorne flipped to the last page of the report. "She's not alone in this, Arthur. Look at the surveillance photos from 3 nights ago." I looked. There was Vivienne, my Vivienne, sitting in a dimly lit corner of a bistro in Back Bay. She wasn't with Julian. She was with a man in an expensive charcoal suit. They weren't discussing estate consultancy. His hand was on her thigh, and she was laughing a real guttural laugh I'd never heard her give my son. "Who is he?" I whispered. "That's Jax Vane," Thorne said. "He's a disbarred attorney who specializes in high-stakes transitions. He's her handler. He finds the marks, she closes the deal, and he handles the legal side to make sure the settlements are ironclad. He's the one who drafted that prenup Julian gave you." I felt the world tilt. My son wasn't just marrying a liar. He was being harvested by a team of predators. And then, as I looked at the photo again, I noticed something in the background. A car, a black Mercedes with a specific license plate. I'd seen that car parked outside my house twice in the last week. They weren't just waiting for the wedding, they were watching me. They were waiting for me to fade away so they could accelerate the timeline. I looked at Elias. I need more. I need the victims. I need someone who can stand in a room and look her in the eye and tell the world what she is. It'll be dangerous, Arthur. People like Jax Vane don't like losing their commissions. I've spent my life making sure things don't fall down, Elias, I said, my voice cold and hard as granite. But for Vivienne, I'm going to make an exception. I'm going to be the earthquake she never saw coming. I walked out of that bar into the cold Boston night, the envelope tucked under my arm. I had 6 weeks until the wedding. 6 weeks to build a case that would not only save my son but utterly destroy the woman who thought I was a dusty old man ready for a retirement home. I didn't know it yet, but the next few weeks would involve a trip to a prison in Illinois, a secret meeting in a rainy alleyway, and the discovery of a secret Vivienne had kept even from her handler, a secret that changed the stakes from a simple con to something much more lethal. As I got into my car, I saw the black Mercedes pull out from a side street, tailing me at a distance. I gripped the steering wheel, a dark thrill of anticipation running through me. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they had just walked into a master architect's trap. The black Mercedes followed me all the way to the iron gates of my Beacon Hill home, its headlights flickering in my rearview mirror like the eyes of a predator that had finally found its pace. I didn't pull into my garage. Instead, I drove 3 blocks past, looped around the narrow, cobblestone streets of the North End, and parked in front of a noisy Italian bistro. I sat in the dark for 10 minutes, watching them idle at the corner. They weren't just observing, they were marking territory. When I finally walked into my house through the service entrance, my heart was hammering a rhythm of pure, cold fury. I wasn't just an old man to be shadowed. I was a man who understood how to build structures that could withstand hurricanes. And right now, I was beginning to see the cracks in Vivienne's own design. The next morning, the psychological warfare began in earnest. I walked into my kitchen to find Vivienne already there, brewing coffee as if she had owned the place for decades. She was wearing a silk robe that had belonged to my late wife, Martha. Seeing her in it felt like a physical violation. A jagged piece of steel dragged across my nerves. Julian was sitting at the breakfast nook, looking through some blueprints for a new residential complex in Back Bay. He looked up, his expression a mix of affection for her and a strange, new pity for me. "Morning, Dad," Julian said, his voice hesitant. "Vivienne was just telling me about what happened last night. She said you got lost coming home from the club?" I froze, my hand hovering over the cabinet handle. "Lost? I've lived in this city for 60 years, Julian. I could navigate Boston blindfolded in a blizzard." Vivienne turned, her expression a masterclass in feigned concern. She walked over and rested a hand on my forearm, the same firm, manicured grip I'd felt at the wedding in my vision of the future. "Arthur, don't be embarrassed. It's perfectly natural at your age. You were seen driving in circles near the North End for nearly 20 minutes. Julian and I were so worried when you didn't come straight home. We thought maybe we should start looking into some professional oversight for your schedule." I looked at her, and for a split second, the mask slipped. Behind that veil of caring daughter-in-law was the cold, calculating Vicky Slattery from Scranton. She was already planting the seeds of my deterioration. If she could convince Julian that I was losing my mind, any evidence I brought forward about her past would be dismissed as the delusions of a man suffering from early-onset dementia. It was a classic gaslighting play, a structural sabotage meant to isolate the target. "I wasn't lost, Vivienne," I said, my voice dropping an octave into the tone I used when a contractor tried to swap out high-grade steel for cheap scrap. "I was taking the scenic route. Something you'll find I do quite often when I want to see exactly who is behind me." Her eyes narrowed, just a fraction. She knew I was onto the tail. But Julian just sighed, rubbing his temples. "Dad, please, just listen to her. We just want you to be safe. Vivienne has even offered to help organize your private office. She says the filing system is a bit chaotic." "My office is private, Julian," I said firmly. "It stays that way." The tension in the room was a living thing, vibrating between us. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I needed to move, and I needed to move fast. I made a show of forgetting where I'd put my car keys, letting Vivienne find them for me on the counter where I knew I hadn't left them. I watched her smug little smile as she handed them to me. She thought she was winning. She thought she was breaking me down. What she didn't know was that I was already halfway to Logan Airport. I told Julian I was heading to our summer house in Chatham for a few days to clear my head. He seemed relieved. Vivienne even packed me a small bag, her movements efficient and cold. As I drove away, I saw the black Mercedes pull out from its hiding spot to follow. But they didn't know that I had swapped cars with Elias Thorne in a parking garage downtown. While they followed my vintage Jaguar toward the Cape, I was sitting on a United flight to Chicago, tucked into a middle seat in coach, wearing a nondescript baseball cap and a windbreaker. I was heading to the bones. Chicago in November is a brutal place, the wind off the lake cutting through you like a serrated knife. I took a cab to a dilapidated industrial district on the south side, far from the gleaming towers I had admired in my youth. I was looking for Silas Blackwood. In the report Elias gave me, Silas was listed as the brother of Vivienne's second victim, Sterling Harrison. But Silas wasn't just a relative. He was a man who had lost everything trying to fight her. I found him in a cramped apartment above a metal fabrication shop. The air tasted of grease and despair. Silas was a man in his late 50s, but he looked 80. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, and his eyes had the haunted look of someone who had looked into the abyss and realized it was looking back. "Arthur Sterling?" he rasped, gesturing for me to sit on a plastic-covered chair. "Elias Thorne said you might come. You're the Boston architect, right?" "The one with the sun." "I am," I said. "I'm here because Vivienne St. Clair is about to destroy my family." Silas let out a dry, hacking laugh. "Vivienne St. Clair? That's a new one. When she met my brother, she was Genevieve Montgomery, a Southern belle with a trust fund that was supposedly tied up in litigation. My brother was a giant in real estate, Arthur. He was a lion. Within 2 years of marrying her, he was a ghost. She didn't just take his money. She took his dignity. She convinced his board of directors he was unstable. She drugged his evening tea with just enough barbiturates to make him stumble and slur his words during meetings. By the time the divorce papers were served, he was a broken man sitting in a locked ward, and she walked away with 40% of the company. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago wind. "What happened to him, Silas?" Silas looked down at his hands. "An accidental overdose 3 months after the settlement. The police called it a suicide. I called it a hit. I tried to go after her. I hired lawyers, I went to the press. That's when the accidents started happening to me. My shop was firebombed. My bank accounts were frozen due to suspicious activity reported by an anonymous source. I spent 2 years in a state penitentiary on a trumped-up racketeering charge, because Jax Vane, her pet lawyer, planted evidence in my office." He leaned forward, his voice a low hiss. "She doesn't just want the money, Arthur. She enjoys the demolition. She likes watching a strong structure crumble. If you fight her the normal way, you'll end up like me, or worse, like my brother. She has friends in high places, and she has Jax Vane to handle the blood work." "I'm not fighting her the normal way," I said, opening my satchel. "I'm an architect. I'm looking for the load-bearing lie. Every con has one. The one thing that, if removed, causes the whole thing to pancake." Silas looked at the documents I'd brought. He spent an hour pointing out similarities in the two cases. The way Vivienne isolated the victims from their families, the way she used health scares to gain power of attorney, and most importantly, the financial funnel. All the money she extracted didn't go into offshore accounts. It went into a shell company called Vane Associates. "She's not the boss," Silas whispered, pointing to Jax Vane's name. "She's the wrecking ball. Vane is the one who chooses the site. He's the one who gets the biggest cut. And there's one thing they're terrified of. Something that happened back in Pennsylvania before she ever became Vicky Slattery." "What?" I asked, my heart racing. "Vicky Slattery had a daughter," Silas said. "A daughter she abandoned in a foster care system that Vane was supposed to clean up. The girl would be about 20 now. Vicky, or Vivienne, is terrified of her. Not because of motherly love, but because that girl is the only person who can prove Vivienne's entire old money pedigree is a lie from the very root. If that girl talks, the fraud isn't just civil. It's criminal. It's identity theft on a federal level." I left Silas's apartment with a name and a location. Elena Rossi, living in a small town outside of Pittsburgh. I had my load-bearing lie, but as I walked toward my waiting cab, a black SUV with tinted windows jumped the curb, blocking my path. 2 men stepped out. They weren't wearing suits. They were wearing tactical gear, and one of them held a silenced pistol leveled at my chest. "Mr. Sterling," the taller one said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Mr. Vane thinks you've seen enough of Chicago. You're coming with us." I looked at the pistol, then at the desolate street. I didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a kidnapping. It was the beginning of a test. They wanted to see if I was as frail as Vivienne had told Julian. They were about to find out that while I might be an old man, I was built of the same reinforced concrete as the buildings I'd spent my life creating. What happened next changed everything. I didn't reach for my wallet or beg for my life. I reached for the one thing I had that they didn't expect: a remote detonator I'd rigged to the fabrication shop's security system before I went upstairs. With a single click, the street was plunged into blinding white light and a deafening roar of industrial sirens. In the chaos, I didn't run away. I ran toward them. As I flew back to Boston that night, bruised but alive, I realized the stakes had shifted. Vivienne wasn't just trying to steal my house. She was part of a syndicate that killed to keep its secrets. And as I walked back into my Beacon Hill home, I found Julian and Vivienne standing in my study. They weren't looking for me. They were looking through my safe, and Julian held a folder of my medical records in his hand, his face pale with shock. "Dad?" Julian whispered, his voice trembling. "Vivienne found these. Why didn't you tell me you were diagnosed with advanced cognitive decline 6 months ago?" I looked at Vivienne. She stood behind him, her face a mask of tragic sympathy, but her eyes were dancing with a cold, triumphant light. She had forged my medical records while I was in Chicago. She had just pulled the trigger on the isolation play. "I didn't tell you, Julian," I said, stepping into the room, "because it's a lie. Just like everything else she's told you." But Julian didn't look at me with belief. He looked at me with the devastating pity of a son who thinks his father has finally lost his grip on reality. I was isolated. I was unstable. And the wedding was only 3 weeks away. I was standing in the middle of my own collapsing life, and for the first time, I wondered if even I was strong enough to hold up the ceiling. The silence in my study wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of a foundation settling into a permanent, catastrophic tilt. I looked at Julian, my only son, the boy I'd raised on bedtime stories about the golden ratio and the strength of Roman arches, and I saw a stranger. He was looking at me with a devastating mix of grief and horror, clutching the forged medical file Vivienne had planted like a pipe bomb in my life. "Dad, why?" Julian's voice was a ragged whisper. "The doctor's report. It says you were diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 6 months ago. It says you've been having episodes of paranoia and spatial disorientation. That's why you got lost in the North End, isn't it? You're sick, and you were too proud to tell me." I looked past him to Vivienne. She was leaning against the mahogany bookshelf, her head tilted in a pose of tragic concern that would have won an Oscar. She had managed to find a blank letterhead from my actual physician, Dr. Eris Montgomery, and used it to draft a death warrant for my autonomy. She was good. She didn't just lie. She built a reality so airtight that the truth looked like the intruder. "Julian, look at the signature," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "Dr. Montgomery's middle initial is P for Preston. This forge uses an L, and the date I was in Kennebunkport on the Muy Bornth, not in his office." Vivienne stepped forward, her hands sliding into Julian's with practiced ease. "Oh, Arthur, the confusion. This is exactly what the report warns about: denial and confabulation. Julian, he's creating these elaborate stories to cover the gaps in his memory. It's a defense mechanism. We talked about this, remember?" Julian looked at the paper, then at me, and his eyes filled with tears. "He didn't get the initial wrong, Dad. It's right there. P. Preston. And the appointment was at Bourne, 1 p.m. I checked your digital calendar on the iPad last night. You'd deleted it, but the cache was still there." My stomach dropped. She hadn't just forged the paper. She'd hacked my devices. She was systematic. She was rewriting my history in real time, and every time I fought back, I only proved her point. To Julian, my defense wasn't logic. It was paranoia. My evidence wasn't the truth. It was disorientation. I was watching the walls of my own mind being painted over with her lies, and for the first time in my life, I felt the cold, suffocating weight of true helplessness. I didn't know it yet, but Vivienne had already contacted the Sterling family lawyers to discuss interim guardianship. "I think you should go to bed, Arthur," Vivienne said softly, her voice like silk over a razor. "We've already called a specialist to come by tomorrow, just for a chat, to help us plan for the transition." I didn't fight her. Not then. An architect knows when a structure is too compromised to save in the moment. I nodded, played the part of the broken, confused old man, and retreated to my bedroom. I locked the door, but I knew that lock was a formality. Vivienne had the spare keys. She had the passwords. She had my son. I sat in the dark, staring at the shadows of the elm trees dancing on my wall. I needed to reach Elena Rossi. If Silas Blackwood was right, Elena was the one structural defect Vivienne couldn't patch. But how do you get out of a house that's become a prison when you're being watched by a professional hitman in a black Mercedes? I waited until Hong a.m. I knew the house's acoustics better than anyone. I had designed the renovation myself in the Cheen Moose. I knew which floorboards in the hallway groaned and which ones remained silent. I didn't use the stairs. Instead, I went through the linen closet in my master bath. Behind a row of cedar shelves was a narrow crawl space, an old dumbwaiter shaft I'd converted into a hidden utility conduit for the smart home wiring. It led directly to the basement, bypassing the second-floor landing where Julian and Vivienne were sleeping. The air in the shaft was stagnant and smelled of dust and old wood. I lowered myself down, inch by agonizing inch, my 62-year-old joints screaming in protest. When I hit the basement floor, I didn't head for the garage. I knew Jax Vane's men would have a sensor on the door. Instead, I used a heavy iron pry bar to pop the grate on the old coal chute. It was a tight squeeze, the rough stones scraping my shoulders, but I tumbled out into the narrow alleyway behind the house, landing in a pile of damp autumn leaves. I didn't take my car. I walked 6 blocks to a Heimweh-Bornauer diner on Charles Street, used a burner phone Elias Thorne had given me, and called a car service under a fake name, Harrison Montgomery. A prestigious name for a desperate man. The drive to the small town of Oakhaven, Pennsylvania, took 7 hours. It was a place. I watched the sunrise over the industrial skeletons of the Rust Belt, the landscape becoming grittier, more honest, the further I got from the polished facades of Beacon Hill. Oakhaven was a town built on coal and kept alive by stubbornness. I found the address Silas had given me, a modest, white-sided house with a porch that needed a new joist and a garden full of hardy, late-season marigolds. A young woman was on the porch, painting a birdhouse. She had Vivienne's eyes that sharp, electric blue, but her face was softer, etched with a weariness that shouldn't belong to a 20-year-old. "Elena Rossi?" I asked, stepping out of the car. She didn't look up from her painting. "If you're from the collection agency, the check is in the mail. If you're from the state, I've already filled out the forms." "I'm not from either," I said, walking closer. "I'm Arthur Sterling. I'm a friend of Silas Blackwood. And I think I'm the father-in-law of the woman you used to call Mom." The paintbrush stopped mid-stroke. Elena looked up, and for a moment, the resemblance to Vivienne was so striking it made my heart skip. But then she narrowed her eyes, and the warmth vanished. "I don't have a mother. I have a biological donor who left me at a Sunoco station when I was 4 years old because I was hindering her career growth. If you're here to tell me Vicky Slattery finally hit the jackpot, you can save your breath. I don't want her money, and I definitely don't want her back." "I don't want her back either," I said. "I want to stop her. She's about to marry my son and dismantle 100 years of my family's history, and she's doing it with the help of a man named Jax Vane." At the mention of Vane, Elena's face went white. She stood up, her hand gripping the porch railing so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. "Jax," she whispered. "He's still with her?" "He's the one who threatened my foster parents. He's the one who told me if I ever tried to find her, he'd make sure I disappeared into the system and never came out." I saw the psychological tension of 20 years of fear bubbling to the surface. Vivienne didn't just abandon this girl. She had her hunted. "Elena, I need you to come to Boston. I need you to stand in a room and tell Julian who Vivienne really is. Not the St. Clair heiress. Not the legacy consultant. I need him to see Vicky." Elena let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "You think she'll just let me walk in? Jax has eyes everywhere. If I even cross the state line, he'll know." "He won't," I said, leaning in. "Because Jax Vane thinks I'm a senile old man trapped in a bedroom in Beacon Hill. He's so focused on the demolition that he's stopped looking at the blueprints. I've spent my life studying how structures fail, Elena. They fail because people get overconfident in their own strength. Vivienne and Jax think they've won. That's when they're the most vulnerable." What happened next changed the entire trajectory of my plan. Elena didn't just agree to come. She walked back into her house and returned with a small, rusted tin box. She opened it to reveal a stack of Polaroid photos and a tattered, handwritten ledger. "Vicky wasn't always a high-end con artist," Elena said, her voice shaking. "Before she met Jax, she was a small-time grifter in the casinos in Atlantic City. She kept a log of everyone she rolled, names, dates, amounts. She called it her retirement fund. She left it in the diaper bag when she dumped me. I think she forgot it was there in her rush to get away with Jax. I flipped through the ledger. It was a goldmine of criminal intent. But as I reached the final pages, I saw a name that made the blood freeze in my veins. Harrison Vance. The very attorney Vivienne had claimed was her family lawyer, the one who had drafted the prenuptial agreement for Julian. The ledger didn't just list him as a mark, it listed him as a partner. Vivienne hadn't just brought a lawyer to the table. She had brought a co-conspirator who had been working with her for over a decade. The prestigious Harrison Vance was just another layer of the facade. I realized then that the trap was far larger than I had imagined. It wasn't just Vivienne and Jax. It was a network of legal and financial predators who had been stripping families of their wealth for years. "We have to go," I said, closing the box. "Now." But as we walked toward the car, a silver sedan pulled into the driveway, blocking us in. The driver's window rolled down, and the cold, arrogant face of Jax Vane looked out at us. He wasn't holding a gun this time. He was holding a cell phone, and on the screen was a live video feed from my study back in Boston. I saw Julian. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by shredded documents. He was holding a picture of his mother, Martha, and he was sobbing. Vivienne was standing over him, her hand on his head, looking directly into the camera with a smile that was nothing short of demonic. "Arthur." Jax's voice echoed from the car's speakers, amplified and mocking. "You really shouldn't have left. Julian is having a bit of a crisis. He found the letters you wrote to your late wife, the ones where you confessed to hating him for being the reason she died. He's a bit fragile right now. Vivienne is the only one he trusts." My heart shattered. She was poisoning the only thing I had left, the love of my son, by fabricating a hatred that had never existed. "If you come back now," Jax continued, his tone light and conversational, "we might be able to keep this in the family. If you don't, well, I've already sent a copy of those letters to the Boston Globe. Architect's secret shame. The real reason for his cognitive decline. It makes for a great headline, don't you think?" I looked at Elena, then at the screen, and I felt the rock bottom I'd been fearing. I was 300 miles away, my son was being psychologically tortured, and my reputation was about to be burned to the ground. "What do you want, Jax?" I rasped. "The Beacon Hill house. The Sterling Trust. All of it. Signed over to Vivienne today. We have the papers ready. Julian will co-sign as your guardian." I stood there in the dust of a Pennsylvania driveway, the weight of a century of Sterling pride on my shoulders, and I realized that to save my son, I might have to lose everything I'd ever built. But as I looked at the rusted tin box in Elena's hand, a new thought occurred to me, a risky, desperate calculation. "Okay," I said, my voice barely audible. "I'll sign. But I want to talk to Julian first. One last time." Jax smiled. "Of course, Arthur. We're not monsters. We'll see you at the Fairmont for the pre-wedding dinner. Tomorrow night. Don't be late. It would be disorienting for everyone." As the silver sedan backed out of the driveway, I turned to Elena. "He thinks he has me in a corner. He thinks he's the one who controls the site. What are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm going to do what any good architect does when a building is rigged with explosives," I said. "I'm going to make sure that when it goes off, it only takes down the people inside." I didn't know it yet, but Vivienne had one more twist waiting for me, a secret about my wife, Martha, that she had unearthed in the family vaults, a secret that would make me question everything I thought I knew about my own life. What would you do if you realized the person you were trying to save was the very person who had been used as a weapon against you for 20 years? The drive back from Pennsylvania to Boston was a descent into a different kind of darkness. Beside me, Elena Rossi clutched the rusted tin box, like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? I was an architect whose life's work was being demolished by a ghost from her past, and she was the daughter Vivienne had discarded like a scrap of blueprint. Every mile marker we passed felt like a countdown to the end of the Sterling legacy. I didn't take Elena to Beacon Hill. I couldn't risk Jax Vane or Vivienne seeing her yet. Instead, I diverted to a nondescript safe house. Elias Thorne maintained in Quincy, a small, salt-battered cottage near the docks where the air tasted of brine and industrial exhaust. "Stay here, Elena," I told her, my voice sounding older than I felt. "Elias will have a man outside. Don't answer the door. Don't look out the windows. I'm going into the Fairmont alone. I need them to believe I'm defeated. I need them to see the broken man they've spent weeks creating." She looked at me, her blue eyes, Vivienne's eyes, shimmering with a sudden, sharp empathy. They're going to humiliate you, aren't they? That's what Jax does. He doesn't just take your money, he makes you crawl for it. I've stood on the girders of 60-story buildings in gale force winds, Elena, I said, forcing a hardness into my tone. I can handle a dinner party. But as I pulled up to the Fairmont Copley Plaza an hour later, that confidence felt as thin as a single-pane window. The hotel was a bastion of Boston's old-money elite. Gold leaf, vaulted ceilings, and a history that breathed through the marble floors. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I hadn't slept in 36 hours. My suit was wrinkled, my eyes were bloodshot, and there was a smudge of Pennsylvania coal dust on my collar. I looked exactly like a man losing his mind. I decided to lean into it. The ballroom was already half full when I entered. The inner circle of the sterling social world was there. The Harrisons, the Kensingtons, and the Miller Garretts. They were sipping Bollinger and discussing the upcoming nuptials. But the moment I stepped into the light, the room went unnervingly quiet. The whispers started instantly, a soft, rustling sound like dry leaves. Is that Arthur? He looks different. Julian said it was advanced. So sad. A brilliant mind. Just gone. I saw them at the center of the room. Julian was standing by the bar, his shoulders slumped, his face a pale mask of exhaustion. Vivienne was beside him, looking radiant in a champagne-colored silk dress that matched the decor perfectly. She was holding court, her hand resting on the small of Julian's back, guiding him through the crowd. When she saw me, she didn't look surprised. She looked satisfied. She broke away from a group of socialites and glided toward me, her smile a masterpiece of tragic grace. Arthur, you made it, she chirped, loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. She reached out and took both of my hands, her grip like iron. We were so worried. Julian said you had a wandering episode? But look at you. You've found your way back to us. I'm here, Vivienne, I rasped, playing the part. I let my gaze wander aimlessly around the room. The lights. They're very bright today, aren't they? I saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a predatory whisper that only I could hear. You look pathetic, Vicky's father-in-law. It's almost too easy. Julian is a wreck. He thinks you hate him. He thinks your whole marriage to Martha was a lie you told to save face. One more push, Arthur, and he'll sign you over to the state. Where is he? I asked, my voice trembling, half acting, half genuine rage. I want to talk to my son. Oh, he's not ready for that, she said, steering me toward a private alcove. But I have something for you, a little get-well gift I found in the Sterling family vault while you were away. She pulled a small, delicate lace handkerchief from her clutch. Wrapped inside was a weathered, leather-bound diary. My breath hitched. It was Martha's. My wife had kept it during the final months of her illness. I had searched for it for years after her death, thinking I'd lost it in the move. You really should have been more careful with your wife's secrets, Arthur, Vivienne purred, flipping the diary open to a page near the end. Martha wasn't just sick, she was lonely. And it turns out, she spent a lot of time with a friend from the architecture firm while you were busy building your towers. A man named Miller Garrett. Does that name ring a bell? I felt a roar in my ears. Miller Garrett was my best friend, my business partner for 30 years. That's a lie, I hissed. Martha loved me. We were a team. The diary says otherwise. She writes about the freedom he gave her, the way he looked at her when you were too busy with blueprints to notice she was dying. I haven't shown Julian yet. I thought I'd give you a choice. Sign the trust over to me tonight, and this diary, it disappears. The letters I found stay between us. Julian gets to keep his memory of a loving mother, even if his father is a senile fraud, if you don't sign. Well, imagine what it will do to Julian to find out his mother was unfaithful and his father knew and kept it quiet just to protect the Sterling brand. The humiliation was complete. She wasn't just taking my money. She was poisoning the very memory of the woman I loved. She was rewriting my entire life as a tragedy of my own making. Sign the papers, Arthur, a new voice said. I turned to see Jax Vane standing in the shadows of the alcove. He was holding a fountain pen and a thick stack of legal documents. Beside him was Harrison Vance, the family lawyer. They looked like two vultures perched on a branch, waiting for the heart to stop beating. We have the guardianship papers right here, Jack said, his tone conversational. Julian has already signed his part. He's the petitioner. He's agreed that for your own safety, the Sterling assets need to be managed by Vivienne. You just need to provide the voluntary signature to avoid a public hearing. I looked out into the ballroom. I saw Julian. He was watching us from across the room, his eyes brimming with a soul-crushing betrayal. He thought I was in here, being convinced by Vivienne for my own good. He thought I was the one who had failed him. I need a moment, I stammered, swaying on my feet. You've had your moments, Arthur, Vivienne said, her voice turning cold and sharp. Sign, now, or I walk out there, find the reporter from the Boston Globe who's currently enjoying the open bar, and I give them the diary and the letters. Your legacy will be a joke by morning. I reached for the pen. My hand was shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I looked at the documents, the transfer of fiduciary responsibility. Everything I had built, the Beacon Hill house, the Cape house, the trust, the firm, all of it going to the woman who had abandoned her own child at a gas station. I touched the nib of the pen to the paper. Wait, a voice boomed across the alcove. We all turned. Standing at the entrance to the alcove was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a look of absolute authority. It was Miller Garrett, my partner, the man Vivienne had just accused of having an affair with my wife. What is this, Arthur? Miller asked, his eyes darting between the documents and the predators surrounding me. Vivienne didn't miss a beat. She moved toward him, her face resetting into that mask of tragic concern. Miller, thank God you're here. We're just trying to help Arthur. He's agreed that for his own safety, he needs to step back. He's been having episodes. Miller looked at me, his expression unreadable. For 30 years, we had built this city together. We had shared dinners, holidays, and the grief of losing Martha. Is that true, Arthur? Miller asked. Are you stepping back? I looked at Vivienne. She gave a microscopic nod, her hand hovering near her clutch where the diary was hidden. A silent threat. I think it's for the best, Miller. I whispered, my heart breaking. I'm not myself. Miller walked over, took the pen from my hand, and looked at the documents. He studied them for a long, agonizing minute. Then, he looked at Vivienne, then at Jax Vane. These papers are extremely thorough, Mr. Vane, Miller said. Almost too thorough for a simple family transition. In fact, they look remarkably similar to the ones used in the Sterling Harrison case in Chicago 3 years ago. You remember that one, don't you? The one where the brother, Silas, lost his business? The temperature in the alcove seemed to drop 20 degrees. Jax Vane's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned into chips of ice. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Garrett. I'm just a humble estate attorney, and I'm just a humble architect, Miller replied, his voice hardening, but I have a very good memory for structural patterns. And Arthur. Arthur has always been the best at spotting a weak foundation. Miller turned to me and did something I never expected. He didn't offer a hand. He leaned in and whispered something in my ear that made the entire world stop spinning. The diary is a fake, Arthur. I was with Martha the night she supposedly wrote that entry. We were at the firm, working on the prudential blueprints. I have the security logs to prove it. She never wrote those words. The realization hit me like a physical strike. Vivienne hadn't found a secret. She had fabricated one. She had spent months studying Martha's handwriting from old letters just to create a forgery that would break me. But I didn't get to celebrate. Because at that exact moment, a scream echoed from the ballroom. I pushed past Miller and ran toward the sound. The guests were scattering, a circle forming in the center of the floor. There, standing in the middle of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, was Elena Rossi. She wasn't alone. She was holding the rusted tin box high above her head, her face etched with a defiant, beautiful rage. And standing across from her, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, was Julian. But it wasn't the daughter's arrival that stopped my heart. It was the man standing behind Elena, his hand on her shoulder. A man I recognized from 40 years ago. A man who had been the lead contractor on my first major project. A man I thought had died in a tragic construction accident decades ago. The foundation was always rotten, Arthur, the man said, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. And I'm the one who buried the bodies. I looked at Vivienne. For the first time, she wasn't smiling. She looked at the man, then at Elena, and she did something she had never done in all the time I'd known her. She screamed, not in anger, but in a primal, bone-deep terror. You, she gasped, pointing at the man. You were supposed to stay dead. The specialist I'd been fearing hadn't arrived. But the past had, and it had brought a wrecking ball with it. The silence in the Fairmont ballroom wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a structural failure. 200 of Boston's elite stood frozen, champagne flutes halfway to their lips, staring at the girl in the thrift store coat, and the man who looked like he'd crawled out of a forgotten grave. Vivienne, or Vicky, as the name now burned in my mind, was backed against the gold leaf catering table, her knuckles white as she gripped the silk tablecloth. The angelic bride was gone. In her place was a cornered animal, bearing teeth that were no longer white, but jagged with fear. The man standing next to Elena wasn't just a contractor from my past. He was Silas Blackwood. I had told Julian he was a man I met in Chicago, but that was only half the truth. 40 years ago, when I was a junior architect with more ambition than ethics, Silas had been my right hand on the Tremont Tower project. Everyone thought he'd died when a crane cable snapped during a midnight shift. I had lived with the guilt of that accident for decades, believing my negligence had buried him. But as he stood there, his face a roadmap of scars, and his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire, I realized I'd been the one lied to. "You thought the concrete was deep enough to keep me down, didn't you, Vicky?" Silas's voice didn't just carry. It vibrated through the floorboards. "You and Jax. You were just kids then, working the site security, but you knew how to rig a winch. You saw a way to take out the man who knew about the kickbacks you were taking from the steel suppliers. You didn't just try to kill me, you stole my life and used my disappearance to blackmail Arthur for 40 years. I felt the room tilt. My entire career, the sterling legacy, had been built on a foundation of blackmail I didn't even know I was paying. The anonymous donations I'd sent to a blind trust for 40 years, money I thought was going to Silas's widow, had been funneling directly into the accounts of Jax Vane and the woman currently wearing my family's heirloom pearls. "Dad?" Julian's voice cracked the tension. He stepped toward me, his face a mask of total disorientation. What is he talking about? Who is this man? And why is Elena? Why does she look like her? He pointed a trembling finger at Vivienne. Vivienne scrambled for the microphone on the head table, her voice shrill and desperate. "Don't listen to them. This is a coordinated attack. Arthur is senile. He's hired actors. This girl, she's a drifter. They're trying to extort us on our wedding day." She turned to the guests, her eyes wide and manic. "Security, get them out. My husband is being targeted by his own father's delusions." But the old money guests weren't moving. They were looking at Miller Garrett, my partner, who was standing beside me with a look of absolute disgust. Miller stepped forward, his voice calm and authoritative. "The only delusion here, Vivienne, is the one you've been selling. I've just had my private security team verify the documents in that tin box Elena is holding. Those aren't just photos. They're the original birth records and the Atlantic City arrest warrants for one Vicky Slattery." Jax Vane moved then. He didn't go for a gun, he went for the exit. But the heavy oak doors of the ballroom didn't open. Elias Thorne had seen to that. The fixer stepped out from behind the velvet curtains, leaning casually against the exit, a digital tablet in his hand. "Sit down, Jax," Elias said, his voice a low growl. "The Boston PD is 5 minutes out, and the FBI is interested in that shell company of yours. It turns out, when you move 40% of a dead man's estate through a Rhode Island credit union, people start asking questions." The ballroom erupted into chaos. The socialites began to push toward the back of the room, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal. Vivienne lunged at Elena, her manicured nails reaching for the girl's face, but Silas Blackwood stepped between them, his massive frame an immovable wall. "Touch her again," Silas whispered, "and I'll show you exactly how that crane cable felt." I pushed through the crowd, my heart racing, and grabbed Julian by the shoulders. He looked like he was in shock, his eyes darting between the chaos and the woman he'd thought he loved. "Julian, look at me. It's over. The letters, the medical records, they were all fabricated. She was never the woman you thought she was. She was a weapon aimed at our family from the very beginning." Julian looked at Vivienne, who was now huddled on the floor, her expensive gown torn at the shoulder, her veil trailing in a puddle of spilled champagne. She looked small. She looked pathetic. She looked like the ghost of every life she'd ever destroyed. "I believed you," Julian whispered, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. "I almost let you commit my father to a cage so you could have his house. I chose you over the man who raised me. Julian, honey, please." Vivienne reached out, her voice shifting back into that practiced, melodic lilt. "I did it for us. He was in the way. He was going to stop us from being happy. I love you." Julian didn't answer with words. He reached up, unpinned the white rose from his lapel, the symbol of their pure union, and dropped it onto her lap. Then, he turned to me, his eyes brimming with a soul-crushing guilt. "Dad, I don't know how to fix this. We build from the ground up, son, I said, pulling him into an embrace. That's what we do. But the reversal wasn't complete. As the sound of sirens wailed outside the Fairmont, Jack's vein let out a jagged, triumphant laugh. He was standing by the window overlooking Copley Square, his phone held high. You think you've won, Arthur? Jack sneered. You think exposing a few old secrets stops the demolition? I've already authorized the final phase. Since Julian was so kind as to sign those interim guardianship papers earlier tonight, the Sterling Trust isn't just in Vivienne's name. It's been leveraged. Every cent of the Sterling firm's liquidity was moved an hour ago into a high-risk offshore hedge fund that just liquidated. The firm is bankrupt. The Beacon Hill house is collateral for a loan that's already defaulted. You can have the truth, Arthur, but you're going to be a pauper living in the street when you tell it. The room went cold. I looked at Miller, who checked his phone, his face paling. He's right, Arthur. The accounts, they're empty. He moved faster than we thought. Vivienne stood up then, the fear vanishing from her face, replaced by a twisted, vengeful glee. She smoothed her dress and looked at the crowd. So, go ahead. Call the police. I'll spend a few years in a white-collar facility, maybe. But when I get out, I'll be the one with the offshore accounts, and the Sterlings will be a footnote in a history book. I didn't just take your money, Arthur. I took your future. I felt the rock bottom I'd been fearing. The Sterling name, the buildings I'd spent 40 years perfecting, the security I'd built for Julian, all of it was being liquidated in real time. I looked at the ballroom, the gold leaf and the marble, and realized it was all just a hollow shell. We were standing in a ruin. But then, Elena Rossi stepped forward. She didn't look at Vivienne. She looked at me. She's lying, mister. Sterling, Elena said, her voice clear and steady. Jax laughed. The girl thinks she knows international banking. Sit down, kid. I don't know banking, Elena said, reaching into the rusted tin box and pulling out a small, encrypted USB drive. But I know my mother. She's a hoarder of leverage. She didn't trust you, Jax. Not for a second. She kept a mirror log of every transaction you ever made. She hid it in my old baby blanket, the one she left me with. She thought I'd never find it, or that I'd be too stupid to use it. But I've been working with Elias Thorne for the last 48 hours. Elias tapped his tablet. The transfer was intercepted, Jax. I didn't just block it. I rerouted the liquidation into a holding account managed by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. The money is sitting in a federal vault right now. And since the signature on the authorization was a forgery of Julian's name, because Vivienne hadn't actually secured the guardianship yet, it's not just fraud. It's a federal wiretapping and embezzlement charge with a 20-year minimum. Jack's Vane's face went the color of ash. He looked at the window, then at the door, but there was nowhere to go. The police were already in the hallway. Vivienne looked at Elena, her own flesh and blood, and for the first time, I saw true, unadulterated hatred in her eyes. I should have left you in that gas station to rot, she spat. Elena didn't flinch. She just looked at her mother with a cold, devastating pity. You did, and that's why I'm the one who's going to watch you leave in handcuffs. The police burst through the doors, the blue and red lights strobing against the ballroom's crystal chandeliers. Vivienne and Jax were led out in silence, their finery looking like cheap costumes under the harsh glare of the law. The St. Clair name died in that ballroom, replaced by the weight of 2 sets of steel shackles. As the room cleared, I sat down at the head table, my legs finally giving out. Julian sat beside me, his head in his hands. Silas Blackwood walked over, his scarred hand resting on my shoulder. We're even now, Arthur, Silas said quietly. The tower is still standing. I'm so sorry, Silas, I whispered. For all of it. Don't be sorry, he said, looking at the city skyline through the window. Be better. You have a son to rebuild with. But as I looked at Julian, I saw that the damage wasn't just financial. He was staring at the spot where Vivienne had stood, his heart shattered into a million pieces. He had been the malleable mark, and the realization was a wound that might never heal. Dad, Julian said, his voice hollow. She said something about Mom, about the letters. Even if the diary was a fake, she knew things. Secrets about our family. Things I don't understand. I looked at Miller Garrett, who gave a slow, somber nod. I realized then that the demolition wasn't over. Vivienne had planted one last delayed charge in our family history, a truth about Julian's own birth, that I had spent 37 years hiding, a truth that could either finish us or finally set us free. Julian, I said, my voice trembling, there's one more blueprint we need to look at. one that was drawn before you were born. The silence of the Beacon Hill Library was different tonight. It wasn't the dignified, scholarly quiet I'd cherished for decades. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness of a vault that had finally been breached. The amber light from the desk lamps seemed to highlight every crack in the leather-bound books, every flaw in the mahogany. Julian sat in the velvet wingback chair across from me, still wearing his tuxedo trousers, though he'd long since ripped away the tie and discarded the jacket. He looked smaller than he had at the wedding. He looked like a man who had survived a plane crash only to realize he'd landed in a desert. "The police have been calling," Julian said, his voice a flat, hollow drone. "They found a storage unit in Vivienne's name, Vicky's name, in South Boston. It was filled with files. Not just on us, Dad. On dozens of families. She wasn't just a con artist. She was a librarian of misery." I stood by the window, looking out at the gas lamps flickering on Mount Vernon Street. My hands, usually as steady as the compasses I used for drafting, were finally trembling. The adrenaline of the ballroom confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, bone-deep exhaustion. She studied the architecture of a person's soul, Julian. She looked for the seismic gaps, the things we're too afraid to say out loud, and she filled them with her own venom. Julian stood up abruptly, the movement jerky and unstable. "But she wasn't just guessing, was she? When she yelled at you in the ballroom, before the police took her away, she said she knew the truth about the Sterling line. She said the foundation was a lie. What did she mean, Dad? If the diary she gave you was a forgery, what was she actually holding over you?" I turned to face him. This was the moment I had feared since the day Julian was born. The moment when the Sterling legacy I had so carefully constructed would have to stand on its own, without the scaffolding of my omissions. I realized then that Vivienne hadn't just been a threat to our money. She had been a mirror, showing me the dishonesty I had practiced in the name of love. "She found a real document, Julian," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "in the vault at the firm, not a diary. A medical file from Mutngin Chinchum Tarmu Tarm." Julian froze. "Mutngin Chinchum Tamwe Tarm? That's the year I was born." "Sit down, son," I said, gesturing to the chair. "Please." I walked over to the safe behind the painting of the Old North Church, the same safe Vivienne had tried to manipulate her way into. I didn't need a code. I knew the numbers by heart. They were the coordinates of the first building I ever designed. I pulled out a weathered, blue folder. It had been buried beneath a mountain of property deeds and trust agreements, hidden like a faulty support beam in a basement. "Your mother and I, we wanted a child more than anything in this world," end quote. I began, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. But the Sterling line, the biological one, it ended with me. I was sterile, Julian. A childhood bout of scarlet fever had seen to that. We tried everything. The best doctors in London, the most expensive treatments in New York. Nothing worked. Martha was devastated. She was the soul of this family, and she felt like a house with no windows. Julian's face was a mask of confusion. "But I'm a Sterling. Everyone says I have your jawline. Everyone says I have the Sterling eye for detail." "Because you are a Sterling?" I said fiercely, leaning across the desk. "But you aren't mine, not biologically." The color drained from his face, leaving him a ghostly, translucent white. The silence that followed was longer than any I'd ever experienced. I watched the realization ripple through him, the collapse of 37 years of identity. "Who?" he finally asked, the word almost inaudible. "It was a pact," I said, "between Martha, myself, and the man who loved us both enough to give us a future." Vivienne found the donor agreement. She found the signature of the man who provided the half of you that I couldn't. I didn't have to say the name. I saw Julian's eyes drift to the photograph on my desk, the one of me and Miller Garrett standing on the roof of the Hancock building, arms around each other's shoulders, triumphant. "Miller?" Julian gasped. My partner? My godfather?" "Your father," I said, and the word felt like a structural failure. He did it for Martha. He did it so the Sterling firm would have an heir, and so Martha would have the joy she deserved. We promised to never speak of it. We buried the records so deep, we thought they'd turned into stone. But Vivienne, she didn't just look at the records. She talked to Miller's old assistant. She pieced together the timeline. She realized that the Sterling legacy was a house built on Miller's blood and my name. Julian let out a sound, a jagged, choked sob that tore through the room. He stood up and backed away from me, his eyes wide with a sense of betrayal that Vivienne Slattery could only have dreamed of inflicting. "Everything is a lie," he shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The Sterling name, the pride, The history. I'm just a project you and Miller worked on. A coordinated development to keep the firm alive. No, Julian, you were the only thing in my life that wasn't a project. I stepped toward him, my heart breaking. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to feel like a guest in your own life. I wanted you to be my son, and you are. A father isn't the man who provides the blueprints. He's the man who stays on the site every day, through the rain and the cold, making sure the walls are straight. But Julian wasn't listening. He was at the door, his hand on the brass knob. You lied to me for 37 years, Dad. You let me grow up believing I was something I'm not. Vivienne was right about one thing: you're obsessed with the structure. You don't care about the people inside. You just want the building to look perfect from the street. He slammed the door, and the sound reverberated through the house like a thunderclap. I stood alone in the library, the blue folder lying open on the desk like an autopsy report. I had won the battle against Vivienne, but I was losing the war for my son's soul. I had hit rock bottom, and the earth beneath me felt like it was turning to liquid. I didn't know it yet, but Vivienne wasn't finished. Even from a holding cell at the Suffolk County Jail, she had one final card to play. She knew that Julian would react exactly this way. She had planned for the truth to be the final demolition charge. The next morning, I woke up to a house that felt like a tomb. Julian's room was empty. His car was gone. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of cold coffee, when the phone rang. It was Elias Thorne. "Arthur, you need to get down to the firm," Elias said, his voice urgent. "There's a situation." "What kind of situation?" "Julian isn't there, Elias. He's gone." "I know he's not there," Elias said. "But Vivienne's lawyers are. They just filed an emergency injunction. Since Julian is the legal beneficiary of the Sterling Trust, and since he's currently unaccounted for and potentially in a state of emotional distress, their words, Arthur, they're claiming that the guardianship papers Julian signed yesterday are still valid until a judge specifically vacates them. And guess who just showed up at the office to claim interim management of the firm? Jax Vane is in jail, Elias." "He can't claim anything." "Jax is in jail," Elias agreed. "But Harrison Vance isn't. He posted bail an hour ago. He's at the office right now, Arthur. He's firing the senior partners. He's shredding the archives. He's liquidating the physical assets. They're burning the house down from the inside out." I felt a sudden, sharp surge of clarity. My son was gone, my secret was out, and my legacy was being incinerated. Most men would have collapsed, but I was an architect. When a building starts to burn, you don't just stand there and cry. You look for the fire suppression system. "Elias," I said, my voice hardening into a cold, lethal calm. "Call Silas Blackwood. Tell him it's time to use that specialized equipment he mentioned. And get Elena. I need her to do something that only a daughter of Vicky Slattery can do." "What are you planning, Arthur?" "I'm going to stop being the architect," I said, grabbing my coat. "It's time to become the wrecking ball. Vivienne wants a demolition? I'm going to give her one that Boston will never forget." I drove to the Sterling firm's headquarters, a glass and steel needle I'd designed in the Chine Meuse. As I pulled up, I saw the black Mercedes parked in the fire lane. Harrison Vance was standing in the lobby, surrounded by security guards I didn't recognize. He looked up and saw me, a smug, arrogant smile spreading across his face. "Arthur, you're just in time for the liquidation," Vance called out, his voice echoing in the marble lobby. "It's a shame about Julian, such a fragile boy. But don't worry, we'll make sure the Sterling name is handled appropriately." I didn't say a word. I walked toward him, my footsteps clicking on the polished stone. I looked at the glass walls, the high ceilings, the perfect structure, and then I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black remote, the master override for the building's smart grid, a back door I'd built into the software 20 years ago and never told a soul about. "You know, Harrison," I said, stopping 10 feet from him, "when you design a building this high, the most important thing isn't the steel, it's the balance. If you shift the center of gravity just a few inches, the whole thing becomes a vertical tomb." I pressed a button on the remote. Across the lobby, the massive, floor-to-ceiling digital displays that usually showed the firm's portfolio flickered and died. Then, they surged back to life. But they weren't showing buildings. They were showing Vivienne's ledger. They were showing the bank transfers to Harrison Vance's offshore accounts. They were showing the hidden camera footage from the Fairmont alcove, where Vance had been caught on tape discussing the liquidation of the Sterling mark. And then the sound started. Not an alarm, a voice. It was Vivienne's voice, recorded by the device I'd hidden in her silk robe weeks ago. "Vance is a greedy pig. Her voice boomed through the lobby's high-fidelity speakers. He thinks he's getting half. But once the Sterling Trust is moved to the Caymans, I'm going to tip off the IRS about his little consultancy scam. I don't share, Jax. Not with anyone. Harrison Vance's smile vanished. He turned to the security guards, his face pale with a sudden, icy terror. Shut it off. Now. But the guards weren't looking at him. They were looking at the doors. Silas Blackwood had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. He had brought 20 of the toughest union ironworkers in Boston, the men who had actually built this city, and who didn't take kindly to a suit like Vance trying to tear it down. The building is under new management. Vance, Silas growled, stepping into the lobby. But as the chaos began, I looked past the ironworkers, past the screaming digital displays, and saw a figure standing in the shadows of the mezzanine. It was Julian. He was holding a phone to his ear, his face unreadable. He looked at me, then at the chaos I had unleashed. He didn't move. He didn't cheer. He just watched. The lobby of the Sterling building was a chaotic symphony of shattering glass and sirens, but all I could hear was the steady, rhythmic thumping of my own heart, the sound of a clock ticking toward an inevitable collapse. Harrison Vance was being dragged toward the revolving doors by 2 uniformed officers, his expensive loafers scuffing against the marble he'd tried to steal. He was screaming about due process and defamation, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the digital displays I'd turned into a public indictment. Silas Blackwood stood in the center of the floor, his arms crossed over his massive chest, watching the man who had stolen his life be hauled away. I didn't look at the police. I didn't look at the reporters. I looked up. Julian was still on the mezzanine, his hands gripping the glass railing so hard I thought it might shatter. He wasn't looking at the chaos below. He was looking at me. And for the first time in 37 years, I saw the truth. My son didn't see a legendary architect. He saw a stranger built of secrets. "It's over, Arthur," Silas said, stepping beside me. His voice was like a hammer hitting an anvil, hard, final, and devoid of celebration. "The suits are gone. But the building is still burning." I ignored him and started toward the stairs. My legs felt heavy, as if I were wading through wet concrete. When I reached the mezzanine, the air felt thinner, colder. Julian didn't move as I approached. He looked out over the city we'd spent our lives designing, the lights of Boston shimmering like 1,000 broken promises. "You knew Silas was alive," Julian said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. "I didn't," I rasped. "I thought he died. I thought I killed him." Julian turned then, and the look in his eyes was sharper than any scalpel. "No, Dad. You hoped he died. Because if he stayed dead, the secret about the Tremont Tower stayed buried." That's what the blackmail was really about, wasn't it? It wasn't just about Vivienne. It was about the fact that the great Arthur Sterling cut corners on his first major project to meet a deadline for the city's elite. Silas didn't fall because of an accident. He fell because you signed off on a substandard winch system to save 3 days on the schedule. I felt the floor drop away. This was the rock bottom I'd been avoiding for 4 decades. The hidden truth that Vivienne had sniffed out wasn't just about Julian's father. It was about the rot at the very center of my soul. I had spent 40 years building monuments to my own vanity, to hide the fact that my career began with a betrayal of human life. I was 22, Julian, I whispered, the words sounding pathetic even to my own ears. I was terrified. The contractors, the city officials. They told me it was standard practice. They told me the safety margins were fluid. When Silas fell, I wanted to confess. I went to the police station 3 times, but every time, Miller Garrett was there to stop me. He told me I'd ruin the firm. He told me I'd ruin Martha's life. "And what about Silas's life?" Julian shouted, the sound echoing through the empty offices. "What about the 40 years he spent in the shadows because you were too terrified to be a man? You built this whole life for me on the bones of your integrity, and you expect me to thank you for it." "I don't expect anything," I said, falling onto a leather bench. "I just wanted to save you from her." "From Vivienne." Julian let out a bitter, jagged laugh. "You and Vivienne are the same, Dad. You just use better materials for your lies. She uses silk and perfume, you use steel and glass. But the intent is the same, to control the narrative. To make sure the world sees the perfect structure instead of the human being underneath." He stepped away from me, his face set in a mask of cold finality. "I'm done, Arthur. I'm resigning from the firm. I'm changing my name. I don't want a penny of the Sterling Trust, and I don't want to see you again. You can keep your towers. I hope you enjoy the view from the top of a tomb." He walked toward the elevators, and I realized I was losing the only thing that had ever mattered to me. I had saved the money, I had stopped the con, but I had demolished the sun. I sat in the shadows of my own headquarters, a billionaire in a bespoke suit, and I realized I had never been more bankrupt. I didn't know it yet, but Vivienne Slattery was watching this play out from a TV in the prison common room, and she was smiling, because her dead man's switch wasn't a document or a recording. It was the destruction of the bond between me and Julian. That was her masterpiece. I sat there for an hour, the building's cleaning crew moving around me like ghosts. The silence was deafening. Then, a hand touched my shoulder. I expected it to be Elias or Silas, but it was Elena Rossi. She was holding a phone, her face pale. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, "you need to see this." "You mind?" She handed me the phone. It was a live feed from a dark web news site, the kind Jax Vane used to seed his rumors. The headline was flashing in neon red. "The Tremont Tragedy. The Sterling Scandal the City Buried." Beneath the headline was a technical drawing the original blueprints for the Tremont Tower, showing my signature on the substandard winch system. And beside it was a video of Vivienne, recorded before her arrest. "If you're seeing this," Vivienne's recorded voice purred, "it means Arthur Sterling thought he could play God. He thinks he won because I'm behind bars. But I've already sent the original engineering logs to the district attorney, the Boston Globe, and every family who lived in the building Sterling designed. The firm isn't just bankrupt, Arthur. It's a crime scene. And since Julian Sterling is the legal successor and current CEO on record, he's the one they're going to indict for the cover-up you've been maintaining for 40 years. I felt a surge of ice-cold adrenaline. Vivienne wasn't just after the money anymore. She was going to send my son to prison for my sins. She knew that as long as Julian's name was on the firm's letterhead, the criminal liability of the ongoing cover-up, the blood money payments I'd been making, fell squarely on his shoulders. I stood up, the exhaustion vanishing, replaced by a clarity I hadn't felt since I was a young man. I looked at the digital screens, at the ruins of my lobby, and then at Silas Blackwood, who was watching me with a strange, expectant look. "She's coming for him, Silas," I said, my voice steadying. "She's going to use my rot to bury my son." "What are you going to do?" Silas asked. "The evidence is out there now. You can't draw over it." "I'm not going to draw over it," I said, walking toward my private office. "I'm going to deconstruct it. Every con has a rhythm, Silas. Vivienne thinks she's the one who controls the timeline because she's the one with the dead man's switch. But she forgot one thing. She's a grifter, and I'm an architect. I know how to turn a building's weight against itself. I didn't call a lawyer. I called Miller Garrett. "Miller?" I said when he answered. "The Tremont file. The one you said you burned in Chinwe High. I know you kept a copy in the Garrett family vault. I need it. Now, Arthur, if that file gets out, we both go to prison. The firm dies." "The firm is already dead, Miller," I shouted into the phone. "But Julian is alive, and if we don't act tonight, he's the one who's going to pay for our pact. I'm going to the district attorney's office. I'm going to confess to everything: the tower, the cover-up, the blackmail. I'm going to take the full weight of the collapse on myself. But I need you to do something for me first." "What?" "I need you to tell Julian the truth about the night he was born. Not the lie about the pact between us. The real truth, the one you and Martha hid even from me." The silence on the other end of the line was the sound of a 40-year-old secret finally cracking. "How did you know, Arthur?" "I didn't," I said, looking at the city lights. "But Vivienne did. That's why she was so confident. She didn't just want the money. She wanted to see the look on my face when I realized I wasn't the only one building a house of lies." I hung up. I had the beginning of a plan, a desperate, high-stakes reversal that required me to walk into a prison cell to save my son. I needed to convince the district attorney to drop all charges against Julian in exchange for a full, unedited confession of 40 years of corporate and criminal malfeasance. But first, I needed to face the woman who had started it all. I drove to the Suffolk County Jail, because I had one piece of information Vivienne Slattery didn't have. One structural defect in her own history that she had buried so deep she thought it had turned into dust. Elias Thorne met me at the gate. He was holding a small, gray envelope. "I found him, Arthur, in a nursing home in Scranton. He's 92, and he's dying. But he has the one thing Vicky Slattery is terrified of." "The original witness?" I asked. "No," Elias said, opening the envelope to reveal a DNA test. "The proof that Vicky Slattery isn't just a con artist. She's a legacy herself. She's the daughter of the man who sold you the substandard steel for the Tremont Tower. Her father was the one who helped you bury the secret. This wasn't a random con, Arthur. This was a second-generation debt collection. She didn't find your secret. She inherited it. I looked at the DNA test, and the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Vivienne wasn't just a predator. She was a ghost of my own making. Her entire life had been fueled by the hatred of the man-me who had let her father take the fall when the Tremont Tower investigation first started 40 years ago. She doesn't just want the money, I whispered. She wants the Sterling name to burn because I'm the reason her own name was erased from the city. The revenge plan was no longer about money. It was about a 40-year-old blood feud that was reaching its terminal point. I walked into the prison visitation room, the heavy steel door clanging shut behind me. Vivienne was waiting, her orange jumpsuit looking like a mockery of her bridal lace. She looked at me and laughed a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. "You look tired, Arthur," she said. "Did Julian leave? I imagine it's quiet in that big house tonight." "He left," I said, sitting down across from her. But before he went, he reminded me of something. He reminded me that a building is only as strong as its foundation. "And yours, Vicky? Yours is built on a very specific kind of rot." I pushed the gray envelope across the table. "I know who your father was," I said, "and I know what he did for me. But more importantly, I know what you did to him to get your start in Atlantic City." The smile on her face didn't just fade, it vanished into a mask of cold, lethal terror. I had found the one thing she couldn't rebrand. The one crime that even Jax Vane didn't know about. "What do you want?" she hissed. "I want Julian's name cleared. I want a signed confession of your involvement in the embezzlement and the framing of my son. And in return." I leaned in, my voice a low, terrifying whisper. "I won't tell the other syndicates you've worked for that you've been scheming their accounts for 20 years to pay for your Saint Clair lifestyle. Because if they find out, Vicky, prison will be the safest place for you to be." I didn't know it yet, but the final twist wasn't about the confession or the tower. It was about what Julian was doing while I was in that prison cell. The air in the prison visitation room felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum, leaving only the cold, sterile scent of floor wax and desperation. Vivienne, the woman who had almost dismantled a century of Sterling pride, sat across from me, and for the first time, she looked like the girl she had once been in Scranton. Small, terrified, and utterly exposed. The threat of the syndicates, the shadow of the men she had stolen from to build her St. Clair fantasy, was the one thing her practiced poise couldn't withstand. She picked up the pen with a hand that shook so violently it rattled against the plastic table. She signed. The confession was a brutal, 5-page admission of guilt. She detailed the embezzlement, the forgery of my medical records, the framing of Julian, and the coordinated effort with Jax Vane to liquidate the Sterling Trust. As she pushed the papers back toward me, her eyes were dead, the blue irises looking like cold glass. "You think you've won, Arthur," she whispered, her voice a jagged rasp. "But you're still the man who let an innocent man rot for 40 years. You're still the man who built a skyscraper on a lie. We're the same. I just didn't have a prestigious name to hide behind." "We're not the same, Vicky," I said, standing up and tucking the confession into my jacket. "Because I'm finally ready to pay for my demolition. You're just looking for the next mark." I walked out of that prison and didn't look back. I didn't go home to Beacon Hill. I didn't call Julian. I drove directly to the Suffolk County District Attorney's office. I walked through the doors at Tarm, Hong AM, just as the city was waking up, and I handed the receptionist my ID. "I'm Arthur Sterling," I told her, my voice echoing in the quiet lobby. "I'm here to confess to a crime committed in Mutngin Chin Trum Tarm Mui Tarm. I'll wait." The next 4 hours were a blur of stenographers, tape recorders, and the grim, professional faces of prosecutors who realized they were about to bring down a giant of Boston industry. I gave them everything. I gave them the Tremont Tower blueprints. I gave them the names of the city officials I'd bribed to keep the safety logs quiet. I gave them the record of the hush money payments I'd funneled to Miller Garrett. I made sure of one thing, and one thing only, that the legal record reflected Julian's complete and total innocence. I testified that I had kept him in the dark, that I had used the firm's resources without his knowledge, and that any management he had performed during the crisis was under my direct, fraudulent influence. I was signing the final page of my statement when the door to the interrogation room burst open. Julian was there, his face a storm of anger and confusion. Miller Garrett was right behind him, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "What are you doing, Dad?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. The DA just told my lawyer you're pleading guilty to felony corporate fraud and manslaughter? You're 62 years old. You'll die in prison. It's the only way the building stays up, Julian, I said, standing to face him. I'm the structural defect, not you. By taking this on myself, the firm can be reorganized. The victims can be compensated from the remains of my personal trust, and you can start over with a clean slate. No secrets. No shadows. Julian shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't care about the firm. I don't care about the name. I just found out my whole life was a lie because of Miller, and now you're leaving? I have nothing. Miller Garrett stepped forward then, his hand trembling as he reached out to Julian, then stopped. He looked at me, a silent, agonizing apology in his eyes. Julian, Miller said, his voice thick with a 40-year-old grief. I need to tell you the final part of the story. The part your mother and I hid even from Arthur. I froze. I thought I'd heard every secret there was. I thought I'd reached the bedrock of our family's shame. The pact Vivienne found. The donor agreement from what Ngin Chin Tram Tarmwe Tarm, Miller began, looking at the floor. It was a ruse. A piece of theater Martha and I staged to protect Arthur. What are you talking about, Miller? I rasped. Arthur, back in the 80s, when the Tremont Tower investigation started to heat up, Vicky's father, the steel supplier, knew you were the one who signed the winch orders. He threatened to go to the papers unless you gave him a seat on the board. But he also threatened something worse. He told Martha that if you didn't comply, he'd make sure the Sterling line was sterilized. He had a cousin who worked in the clinic where you were going for your fertility treatments. My heart stopped. I remembered that clinic. I remembered the cold, clinical voice of the doctor who told me I'd never have a son. He didn't just threaten it, Miller continued, his voice breaking. He bribed the doctor to give you a fake diagnosis. He wanted you to believe you were broken, Arthur. He wanted to crush your spirit so you'd be easier to control. But Martha found out. She knew the diagnosis was a lie. But she also knew that if she told you, you'd confront him, and he'd kill you. So she came to me. She told me we had to make the steel supplier believe he'd won. She made me sign that fake donor agreement so that if the supplier ever tried to claim you weren't the father or tried to use your sterility as leverage to prove you were being blackmailed, we had a legal shield. Julian looked at Miller, then at me, his mouth agape. So, the pact was a lie? Miller isn't my father? I was never the donor, Julian, Miller said, a sad, beautiful smile touching his lips. I loved Martha, yes, but I loved Arthur more. I spent 40 years being the backup so that you two could have a life. Martha took that secret to her grave to keep you both safe. Arthur, you were never sterile. Julian is yours. He's always been yours. Every jawline, every eye for detail, every ounce of stubbornness it's Sterling through and through. I looked at my son, my real son, and I felt a weight lift off my soul that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The rot wasn't in our blood. It was in the fear we'd allowed to dictate our lives. I reached out, and this time, Julian didn't pull away. He collapsed into my arms, and we stood there in the middle of a police station, two men whose world had been demolished and rebuilt in the span of an hour. The legal fallout was as brutal as I'd expected. The Sterling name was stripped from the buildings I'd designed. The Beacon Hill house was sold to pay the restitution fund for the families of the Tremont Tower workers. I was sentenced to 10 years in a federal facility. It sounded like a death sentence to some, but to me, it felt like the first honest thing I'd ever done. 18 months later, the visitor's room at the minimum security camp in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, was bathed in the soft light of a spring afternoon. I sat at a picnic table, wearing a rough, gray jumpsuit that felt more comfortable than any tuxedo I'd ever owned. Julian walked across the grass toward me. He looked different. He'd dropped the Sterling from his name, going by Julian Garrett now, a nod to the man who had protected us both. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, his hands calloused from actual work. "How's the firm, son?" I asked as he sat down. "It's not a firm anymore, Dad," Julian said, grinning. "It's a cooperative. We're working on sustainable housing in the South End. Small scale, honest builds. No skyscrapers, no glass needles. Just homes that people can actually live in." "And Elena?" "She's finishing her degree in social work," Julian said, his eyes softening. "She's working with foster kids in Oak Haven. We're talking about moving in together next year. She wants to build a garden." I looked at him, the man he'd become without the weight of my legacy, and I realized that the greatest building I'd ever designed was standing right in front of me. He wasn't a Sterling by name, but he was a man of integrity, built on the truth I'd finally been brave enough to tell. "I found something in the archives the other day," Julian said, reaching into his bag and pulling out a small, framed blueprint. "It was the very first sketch you ever made, the one of the treehouse you wanted to build for me when I was 5. I looked at the drawing. It was simple, crude, but the lines were honest. "You know," Julian said, sliding the frame across the table. "You always told me that a building is only as strong as its foundation. I used to think you meant the concrete. But I get it now. The foundation isn't what you put in the ground. It's what you're willing to sacrifice to make sure the people inside are safe." "I'm proud of you, Julian," I said, my voice thick. "I'm proud of you too, Dad," he replied, "for finally letting the towers fall." As the guard signaled that visiting hours were over, I watched Julian walk away toward the gate. He didn't look back at the prison. He looked forward, toward the city, toward the life he was building with his own 2 hands. I stood there, a man with nothing left but the truth, and I realized that for the first time in 60 years, I wasn't afraid of the cracks. I was an architect of a different kind now. I was a man who knew that sometimes you have to tear everything down to find the one thing that was always worth keeping. The Sterling name was gone. But the Sterling heart, that was finally, for the first time, built to last.